You've probably been told, at some point, that humans domesticated cats. That somewhere back in the mists of agriculture, a person looked at a small predator and decided to put it on payroll. Here's the question nobody asks. What if that's backwards? What if the species sitting on your couch right now never actually agreed to anything? To understand what really happened, you have to start with what a cat is when nobody's watching. Long before any cat slept on a couch, it lived alone across the deserts of the Middle East and North Africa. It hunted alone. It didn't form packs, didn't share territory, didn't need anyone else to survive a bad week. A wolf needed its pack to take down something bigger than itself. A cat needed nothing but patience and a working set of reflexes. That detail matters more than it sounds. Whatever happened next happened to an animal with zero instinct for cooperation to begin with. For most of human history, that animal wasn't worth a second look. People were busy fearing things that could actually kill them. Wolves, bears, whatever, moved in the dark past the firelight. Then, somewhere around 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans did something that changed the math entirely. They stopped wandering. They started farming. They built villages. They grew crops. And for the first time in the species' history, they began stacking enormous quantities of food in one fixed place. Grain, if you're a rodent, is the single best discovery in the history of your species. Mice arrived first. Rats followed. Within a few generations, farming villages weren't just home to humans, they were dense, reliable, year-round buffets for anything small enough to squeeze through a wall. To a modern homeowner, a mouse problem is an inconvenience. To a farming family 10,000 years ago, it was existential. Lose the grain store, and you didn't lose a snack, you lost the winter. And somewhere just outside the firelight, a wildcat noticed. It didn't take much imagination. Humans had, by complete accident, concentrated thousands of prey animals into one small, defended, predictable area. For a solitary hunter used to covering miles of desert for a single meal, that's the best hunting ground on the planet, and it isn't going anywhere. So the boldest cats came closer, not all at once, carefully at night, testing how near they could get before getting chased off. The ones that could tolerate the noise and the smell of an entirely different species kept eating. The nervous ones stayed in the desert, fighting over scraps of dwindling prey. That's not a training program. That's natural selection, running quietly in the background for thousands of years, with humans barely aware they were a variable in someone else's evolution. If the idea that we got recruited into our own pet's evolution sounds like the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe. This channel runs on exactly this kind of reversal. And here's where the story splits from every other domestication story you've heard. Dogs changed dramatically once they joined human life. Their skulls, their temperaments, their entire social wiring shifted under generations of deliberate human selection. Cats barely changed at all. The African wildcat that gave rise to the modern house cat still looks like, well, a house cat. If one walked across your street tomorrow, you'd assume it belonged to a neighbor. That's because nobody was actually breeding cats for calmness. Not at first. Humans tolerated the cats already showing up because the cats were already doing the job. There was no program to design, just an open door kept open for as long as the arrangement kept working. Which explains why your cat still hunts the way it does. Watch one stalk a dust mote across the floor, freeze mid-stride at a sound you didn't even hear, then sprint down a hallway at 3 a.m. for reasons that exist only in its own head. None of that is decoration. That's an unmodified predator running its original software inside a domestic shell, because nobody ever rewrote the code. Somewhere in this same stretch of history, a cat ends up buried on Cyprus, an island with no native wildcats of its own, which means somebody brought it there on purpose. People don't usually transport an animal across open water and bury it with apparent care unless that animal has already become something more than livestock. For a long time, that single burial was treated as proof the relationship had already become something close to companionship, right there in the Fertile Crescent, right as agriculture took off. It's a tidy story. Farmers, grain, cats moving in together, all in the same place, all at once. But a tidy story, and a well-evidenced one, aren't always the same thing. And this is one of the places where the science was about to force a rewrite. Before that rewrite, though, the relationship stops being practical and starts being theological. Enter Egypt, a civilization that didn't just tolerate cats. It built an entire religious apparatus around them. The goddess at the center of it is Bastet. Her imagery didn't start out feline at all. Early depictions gave her a lion's head, tying her to older, fiercer solar deities. Somewhere between the 9th and 7th centuries BCE, that imagery softened into something smaller, more domestic, the cat-headed goddess most people picture today. The shift in her face tracks a shift in how an entire civilization had started to feel about the animal itself. And Egyptians didn't just keep cats around the house, they mummified them by the millions. In 1888, an Egyptian farmer plowing a field near Beni Hassan broke through into a vast animal cemetery, packed with row upon row of mummified cats. Nobody at the time treated it as sacred. A British company bought up roughly 19.5 tons of the mummies, something like 180,000 individual cats, shipped them to Liverpool, and sold the lot at auction in 1890 to be ground into fertilizer. One report has the auctioneer using a cat's skull as his gavel. A civilization that once worshipped these animals as instruments of a goddess had, 3,000 years later, become topsoil for someone else's turnip field. The scale of that mummification points to something else. Cats weren't just being kept. They were bred in large numbers, specifically to be sacrificed as offerings. And breeding any animal together, generation after generation, tends to favor the calmest individuals, the ones who can tolerate crowding without losing their minds. Some researchers now argue this religious industry, not quiet farmyard pest control, may have been the real engine that pushed cats from tolerated guest to fully domesticated animal. So, if the Egyptian temples were the real engine, what happened to that tidy Cyprus story, the one where cats and farmers moved in together thousands of years earlier? It collapsed, and the team that collapsed it didn't even set out to. For years, the working assumption based on mitochondrial DNA was that cats spread into Europe alongside Neolithic farmers, roughly 6,000 years ago, riding the same wave of agricultural expansion that carried wheat and cattle westward. Farmers had grain, grain had mice, mice had cats. Case closed. Then, in 2025, a team led by researchers at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata, ran full nuclear genome analysis, a far higher resolution tool than mitochondrial DNA alone, on dozens of ancient and modern cat samples. The 6,000-year story fell apart in their hands. The cats living in Europe and Turkey during that early farming period turned out to belong to an entirely different, never domesticated species, the European wildcat. Some carried genetic traces resembling African wildcats, but that wasn't migration. It was hybridization between two wild species that happened to share the same territory. No domestic cat made that trip at all. The actual domestic cat didn't reach Europe until roughly 2,000 years ago, and it came from North Africa, almost certainly Tunisia, not the Levant. It arrived in two waves. The first carried wild cats from northwest Africa to Sardinia sometime in the first millennium BCE. The second, far larger wave rode in on the back of an empire. Domestic cats spread across the continent during the Roman period, hitching rides along trade routes and military supply lines so efficiently that feline remains have turned up at Roman army outposts as far apart as Austria, Serbia, and Britain. Which means that famous Cyprus burial almost certainly wasn't the opening chapter of a Fertile Crescent love story at all. It was an isolated outlier. The real continental spread was still many centuries away, and it was coming from an entirely different direction. China tells nearly the same story, with its own twist. For years, small cat bones at Chinese farming sites suggested domestic cats had arrived there too, riding along with early rice farmers thousands of years ago. Genetic testing on bones between roughly 3,500 and 5,400 years old said otherwise. Those weren't domestic cats. They were leopard cats, a separate wild species that had learned to scavenge around human settlements without ever being tamed. That species didn't even survive the transition. It vanishes from the archaeological record around 200 CE, in the same turbulent stretch that saw the collapse of the Han Dynasty. The actual domestic cat didn't reach China until the 7th century CE, during the Tang Dynasty, arriving along the Silk Road. By the time cattle, sheep, and horses had already been part of Chinese life for millennia, the cat was still the new arrival. So the timeline keeps moving forward. The origin of that relationship keeps getting more recent. By some measures, cats are among the most recently domesticated animals on Earth, joining the human household long after the wheel had already transformed human life. And once they were in, they didn't stop being strategic about it. Adult wildcats almost never meow at each other in the wild. It's a kitten sound, mostly aimed at a mother. Domestic cats kept using it into adulthood and refined it for an audience of exactly one species. Researchers comparing the calls of wildcats and house cats found the domestic version consistently shorter, higher-pitched, easier on the human ear, closer, almost suspiciously so, to the pitch of a human infant's voice. Then there's the purr, a low rumble sitting in a frequency range roughly 20 to 140 Hz that overlaps with frequencies used in physical therapy for bone and tissue repair. Researchers have measured real effects in the humans on the receiving end: lower blood pressure, eased pain perception. A cat settling onto your chest may be running a small, ongoing experiment on your nervous system. It's been running it for thousands of years. There's a second purr, too reserved for moments a cat actually wants something. Acoustic analysis found this solicitation purr carries a frequency component strikingly close to a human infant's cry, tucked inside an otherwise soothing sound, aimed at the exact part of the human brain that can't tune out a baby's distress. None of this required intention, generation after generation. It only required that the cats who happened to sound a little more appealing got fed a little more reliably. Over enough centuries, that isn't manipulation. That's just what evolution looks like from the outside. And the reward humans get for putting up with it isn't small. Interactions with cats appear to trigger the same neurochemical reward pathways, dopamine, oxytocin, associated with bonding to another person. The effect seems strongest precisely when the affection is unpredictable. A cat available all the time is comforting. A cat that ignores you for 3 days, then chooses your lap with no warning, produces something closer to relief mixed with reward. The same basic mechanism that makes a slot machine more compelling than a vending machine. So ask yourself what's actually sitting in your house. Through the temples, the trade ships, the genetic detective work, the careful tuning of a sound built to mimic your own offspring, the cat itself changed astonishingly little. Its genome today sits remarkably close to its wild ancestors, far closer than a dog's sits to a wolf's. Plenty of feral cats slide back into fully wild behavior within a single generation, given the chance. By any strict definition, domestication for cats may still be unfinished business, even after several thousand years inside our houses. Dogs joined human life as partners, bred over millennia into something built to read us, to want our approval. Cats joined as opportunists who discovered that human civilization happened to be the best hunting ground on Earth, and who never fully signed the contract that came with staying. Tonight, somewhere in a house its ancestors never had to imagine, a cat, bred from desert hunters, shaped by sailors and emperors, and a goddess who changed her own face to look more like it, will do something completely unremarkable. It will sit close, but not quite within reach. It will make a sound that means something between "I want this" and "I tolerate you." And a human brain built by 10,000 years to answer to exactly that sound, will feel something close to warmth. It will never quite ask why. If you made it this far, you already know this channel finds the stories everyone else missed. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments about your experiences with your household felines.